Dr. Joas Wagemaker. I think that was one of the, that was really fascinating discussion on the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, and you have, I think, unraveled or unpacked, the kind of, one can say, confusion when one tries to understand Muslim Brotherhood within a specific territory or as a transnational organization, transnational movement. It always leads to different kinds of confusion in terms of what about the ideology, about political participation, and the organization itself has, in terms of, if one looks at its functioning or its existing in different territories, it is very diverse in terms of the way it expresses. So that leads to a lot of misunderstandings, a lot of lack of understandings also in terms of what the organization is. So I think that was a very good presentation in terms of unpacking, with a specific reference to Jordan. And you have brought some of the very significant issues related to moderation and division, ideology and political participation, and then societal freedoms and freedom of thought. I would now invite our audience to start to send in their questions. There is one question which I have already in the chat box from Aditya, which is, what is the Brotherhood's attitude towards the monarchy, since the Hashemite kingdom is a direct descendant of the Prophet? Secondly, what was King Hussein's perception of Brotherhood? Did he encourage them? So that is one question. I would also encourage others among the participants to either send in their questions or raise their hands if you want to ask their question. And we have independent scholar from Britain, Miss Jacqueline Hoover. Ma'am, if you have any question, in case to Dr. Joas Wagemaker, and you would like to come and ask your question through the audio or video.
Shall I answer the first question first?
Yeah, maybe you can start.
Okay. Sure. Yeah, well, what is the Brotherhood's attitude towards the monarchy since the Hashemite king is a direct descendant of the Prophet? That's certainly correct. It really depends on who you ask. The Muslim Brotherhood is one of the few, or perhaps the only organization in Jordan that has really successfully integrated East Jordanians and Palestinian Jordanians. And there are some people within the Muslim Brotherhood, particularly in the 1980s and 1990s, not so much anymore, who were very pro-regime, who were perhaps not monarchists, but they were definitely pro-regime. They saw that King Hussein was a force for good, particularly in comparison to some of the dictators that you saw in the Middle East, such as Hafiz al-Assad in Syria and Gamal Abdel Nasser in Egypt. And they saw him as someone who represented Sunni Islam, who had a prophetic pedigree, as you rightly mentioned, and as such had perhaps not a religious authority, but had some sort of East Jordanian political authority that they looked up to and that they thought was important. That point of view has been represented more, I'm not saying exclusively, but more among East Jordanian Muslim brothers than among Palestinian Muslim brothers. So it's important to them, but it's not all important to them. For them, King Hussein or the other kings of Jordan have been seen as a sort of beacon of stability, in a sense, that they wanted to support. Now, with regard to the other way around, really, what was the King Hussein's perception of the Brotherhood? Did he encourage them? King Hussein was grateful to the Muslim Brotherhood because the Muslim Brotherhood supported him at certain crucial moments. The chapter that was just referred to that I contributed to Professor Quamar Aswami's book on, or edited volume, I should say, on Jordan. No, actually, it was a different chapter. I'm sorry, I'm getting mixed up here. the Muslim Brotherhood supported the Jordanian monarchy throughout its history, and particularly during the Cold War period. So there were several challenges that the kingdom was confronted with. So, for example, Nasserism from Egypt. It was the Palestinian question, of course. There was Black September in 1970 when some Palestinian militants tried to hijack 4 planes and try to basically overthrow the Jordanian regime. There was the supposed Nasserist coup of 1957. And there were all kinds of challenges. And the Muslim Brotherhood basically, throughout that period, stuck with the Jordanian monarchy. And the Jordanian monarchy acknowledged that. And the king was grateful for that and also gave them the room to operate. But I don't think that the King Hussein, that is, was ever really was a fan of the Muslim Brotherhood. I think if you look at the work by Marion Bulby, who's written a very interesting book about the kings of Jordan and the Muslim Brotherhood, she clearly writes that King Abdullah I, the founder of Jordan, really reached out to the Muslim Brotherhood and accepted the Muslim Brotherhood because he wanted to shore up and underscore his own religious credentials, because he was basically he was from Mecca on the Arabian Peninsula. He came to Jordan and he was made the king of a country that he'd never been to, really. So he needed all the authority and all the sort of status that he could get, and if he could use the Muslim Brotherhood to underscore that, he would. So I think that it started really as a marriage of convenience. But King Hussein was definitely grateful for that, and he acknowledged that, and he gave them what they wanted to a certain extent. That is not to say that King Hussein never used the Muslim Brotherhood, for example, in its relations with Syria, or in electoral politics after 1989. The sort of democratization that happened in Jordan after 1989 has often been described, or sometimes been described, as facade democratization, which is really a way of channeling discontent through parliament rather than real and genuine democratization. And the Muslim Brotherhood has certainly borne the brunt of that. The Muslim Brotherhood has actually been sort of bureaucratized into submission, in a sense. The Muslim Brotherhood was clearly seen from the early 1990s onward by the regime under King Hussein as a threat to not so much stability, but certainly as a political threat. And the Jordanian monarchy under King Hussein has taken measures to limit the influence of the Muslim Brotherhood. So they're sort of frenemies. You know, they're not enemies, they're not friends, but they're sort of in between. And King Hussein allowed them, he allowed them to expand their activities, but only within certain limits. Shall I take the next question straight away?
Maybe there are a couple of other questions which you can perhaps take. Or maybe should I ask the respective person to ask their question if they want to explain, if that is all with you. So we have a question from Dr. Samina Hamid. Ma'am, would you like to ask your question?
Yeah, thank you. I just have a simple query. What was Brotherhood's take when thousands of Jordanians joined ISIS, reportedly joined ISIS? Given all your moderation that you talked about, they don't square together. So what's your thoughts on that? Thanks.
Right. Thank you. That's an important question. You would have noticed that the things I was talking about in my presentation really focused on internal politics, or internal Jordanian politics. Many Jordanians, in fact, I would say probably the overwhelming majority of Jordanians, thought it was horrible what was happening in Syria, and thought that the fight against Bashar al-Assad was justified. Whether Jordanians should actually go there and do that fight themselves was a different kettle of fish, of course. They might say, okay, if Syrians want to fight their own regime, that's fine, but Jordanians shouldn't go there. So those are two different things. The Muslim Brotherhood did not encourage Jordanians to go there, but they did believe, as many other Jordanians did, that the fight in and of itself was justified. They also believed, and this really has to do with their sometimes very anti-Western views, particularly anti-American views, that the United States should not get involved in this, that Russia was to blame for some of this, that other countries, for example, Hezbollah and Iran were to blame for some of this, but that if America wanted to fight the Syrian regime, even though they believed that that was a justified fight, America shouldn't do that, because America should leave them alone and not get involved. With regard to the 3,000 Jordanians who went to join the Islamic State in Syria, I think the number is about right. The Muslim Brotherhood was, on the one hand, they understood that. They believed, look, we believe it's a justified fight, so we can understand that people go there, but they did not encourage it. They also condemned the behavior of the Islamic State. Sometimes this was not always very clear. For example, Hamza Mansour, who was the leader of the Islamic Action Front during the period when I did my research, which was the political party of the Muslim Brotherhood, he was once asked, do you condemn the terrorism of the Islamic State? And his answer was not an unequivocal, yes, I condemn that, but he said, I condemn all terrorism. And the problem with that was not so much that he did not condemn the Islamic State, because he did, but he wanted to include other people that he believed were terrorists. For example, the Israeli, what he would refer to as state terrorism against the Palestinians. And he kept giving that answer, I condemn all terrorism, I condemn all terrorism. And that interview was recorded before the news came out of the Jordanian pilot, a fighter pilot, Mu'adh al-Kasasiba, who was burned alive by the Islamic State. But so it was recorded before it, but it was broadcast after it. So you have the Islamic State burning a Jordanian fighter pilot, and all Jordanians have a family member in the army or a friend in the army, because they have conscription. So that's very personal to a lot of Jordanians, and they see on television one of them being burned alive by the Islamic State, and then the next day or a few days afterwards, they see the leader of the Islamic Action Front refusing to unequivocally condemn the terrorism of the Islamic State. That doesn't look good. Even though he meant it in a far more nuanced way, that doesn't look good. So then afterwards he said, yes, I condemn their terrorism. So if your point is that the Muslim Brotherhood has not always been completely unequivocal in its condemnation of the Islamic State, yes, I agree, you're right. But they are definitely, obviously far more moderate than the Islamic State with regard to internal issues as well as external ones. And they have a nuanced view on the Syrian conflict that does not encourage Jordanians to go there.
Thank you, Dr. Wagemakers. Ahmed Tashfeen had a question. Ahmed, would you like to ask the question?
Yeah, thank you for your insightful lecture. My question was basically regarding with the current UAE and Saudi Arabia push to declare Brotherhood as a terrorist organization in the region. So how does it impact internal politics within Jordan? How the Muslim Brotherhood looks at it?
Yeah, that's a very important question, and that is a question that has had serious repercussions already. When the Arab Spring erupted, if we can still call it the Arab Spring, in 2011, late 2010, early 2011, the Muslim Brotherhood was basically united in saying, this is our moment. This is when we need to push for an Islamist solution, because, we see, and I remember I was in the Islamic Action Front headquarters in Amman when the news came in that Mohammed Morsi had been elected, or perhaps not the news came in, but it had just come in, something like that. And they were very cheerful about that. They said, one of us is now president in Egypt. So they felt that that was their moment in 2012. But slowly but surely, the developments that you refer to in your question started coming along. So the United Arab Emirates started saying, the Muslim Brotherhood is a terrorist organization. Saudi Arabia started saying that. Then, of course, there was the coup in Egypt in 2013, and the Egyptian regime started saying that. And slowly but surely, developments within the Muslim Brotherhood led to more and more people saying, well, we should be careful. We can use the Arab Spring to push for our own solutions, or we can look at the signs in the region and read them properly and conclude from them that we are going to be next, that the regime is going to look for an excuse to repress us. And Zaki Beni Rashid, who at the time was the deputy leader of the Muslim Brotherhood, he, in a Facebook post, criticized the United Arab Emirates, and he was imprisoned for it. So that's when I said, it's had serious repercussions. And the Muslim Brotherhood itself, of course, has been outlawed in Jordan, and there is now a new Muslim Brotherhood. There is still a Muslim Brotherhood, but it's actually not the old one, it's the new one. The old one has been dissolved. So the regional situation with the United Arab Emirates, Saudi Arabia, and Egypt being against the Muslim Brotherhood has very much impacted the Muslim Brotherhood in Jordan, in the sense that it has facilitated the outlawing of the Muslim Brotherhood. It has created a sort of atmosphere in which taking action against the Muslim Brotherhood was allowed and was possible. And the Muslim Brotherhood partly saw that coming, but partly certainly did not see that coming. And the ones who did not see it coming, those are the ones who eventually lost their positions, who sometimes went to prison. And the ones who did see it coming decided to ally with other people, to set up their own parties, to re-establish ties or cement their existing ties with the regime. And they are now in parliament, perhaps not very strongly, perhaps not very successfully, but at least they are still there.
Sajid,
Thank you.
you wanted to ask a question?
Hello.
Yes, you are audible.
Sorry, sir, I think you have partially answered that question already with respect to Samina ma'am's question. My question was that, what was the stance of Muslim Brotherhood during the Syrian conflict, and did the interest of the monarchy converge in that case? And secondly, sir, I wanted to know what are the organizational strategies of Muslim Brotherhood in Jordan? Do they focus on union activities among the professional classes, like say teachers union and so on? How do they organization stuff? Thank you.
Right, thank you. Well, with regard to the first question on Syria, I think, yes, their interests to a certain extent did converge. Both the Jordanian monarchy and the Muslim Brotherhood were very worried about the situation in Syria. They condemned the behavior of the Syrian regime, but at the same time, they did not encourage Jordanians to go there and fight. So they tried to find a diplomatic solution, and very much also an Arab solution, so a solution among Arab countries without international involvement. So I think the short answer to that question is yes, basically they converged. With regard to your second question, the Muslim Brotherhood has long had a strategy of trying to, I'm trying to avoid the word infiltrate because it makes them sound as if they were criminal, and that's not what they are, but sort of to integrate into unions, trade unions, like the teachers union, for example, syndicates, professional syndicates, for example, lawyers, journalists, etc. And they've been very successful on the whole in that. They have very often won elections in these syndicates. I have not focused on these things specifically. Others have. So I won't be able to give you any detailed information on that, but yes, they have done that. And as such, it's very much through civil society organizations such as those that they have broadened their influence. They have spread their message. And it's not only through sermons in the mosques and through social activities, but very much also through these professional organizations, because the Muslim Brotherhood in general is very much a middle class organization. So not of the elite, not of the poorest classes, but very much the type of middle class organization of professionals working in these organizations. So it's sort of obvious and logical that they would take that option. Yes.
Thank you. There is one question from Mr. Anand. He's unable to kind of come on the audio, so I'll ask, what was the response or reaction of three diverse brotherhood groups, as you classified, to the Abraham Accords? Could there be some polarization or increased coherence within the brotherhood as a result of the accords?
Yes, that's a very interesting question, and I need to be specific here. With regard to the Palestinian question, the Muslim Brotherhood is divided between those who believe that the Muslim Brotherhood should focus first and foremost on Jordanian affairs, and those who believe that the Muslim Brotherhood is primarily there to make the case for Palestinian rights and statehood and independence in Jordan. So there is a difference among different Muslim brothers about where the emphasis should lay. Should the emphasis be on Jordanian issues or on Palestinian issues? That is a real division within the Jordanian Muslim Brotherhood. What they are not divided on, and that's an answer to your question, is the Palestinian question. Because basically, and I hesitate to generalize, but I think I really can generalize in this respect, that all Muslim brothers strongly support the Palestinians against Israel, strongly support Palestinian rights, and I would go so far as to say that they probably all support a Palestine, not just in the 1967 borders, but from the river to the sea, so instead of Israel. And I would argue that the Jordanian Muslim Brotherhood is probably more anti-Israel and pro-Palestinian than the Palestinians themselves, in fact. So they were very much against the Abraham Accords. They saw it as an attempt, an international attempt, to take away the enemies of Israel and to allow it to provide Israel with the room to repress the Palestinians even more than they already have in their reading of the situation. So I think that the organization as a whole was very much against those agreements.
Thank you, Dr. Wagemakers. May I, at this stage, request Sir Quamar to come and have his comment or question?
Thanks, Muddassir. I think any author of a book is very eager to know how the book was eliciting reaction from the countries. So I want to know, what is the response you got from the scholars about your book? And secondly, is there any response or a feedback you got from the Muslim Brotherhood circles in Iran, in Jordan? How did they react to your work? Thank you very much.
Well, the response to my book has been limited because it's only been out a few months, and I was supposed to go there and present the book in Jordan itself, but obviously because of the Corona situation, I wasn't able to. So in that sense, I could give you a very short answer in the sense that it's limited. But obviously, I did field work there, and the response to my field work was very unsurprised. Because quite a bit of research has been done on Jordan, and Muslim brothers have often been involved in this research. And with regard to my previous book on Salafism in Jordan, many people were often asking me, why are you doing this? Why are you interested in this? Why do you even talk to us? I interviewed people that had never been interviewed before, actually quite a few. With regard to the Muslim Brotherhood, all of these people had been interviewed before. I was just taking a different approach. I was focusing on their ideology. And that, I think, some people found refreshing. That was one of the responses. They said, oh, here is a guy who's really interested in our ideas. They were also, I also confronted them with ideological differences. And that's what they sometimes found a bit confrontational, as if I was trying, that wasn't my intention, but as if I was trying to confront them with divisions within the movement. And I was not doing that to say, there are people who believe differently within your group and you should, stay in line or something like that. That was not at all my intention. It was just to really get to the nitty-gritty of these individual ideological differences. That was what was most important to me. And sometimes I had to say that explicitly and said, this is not an attack. What I'm asking you is not an attack on you. It's simply because I'm very interested in ideology. And one final thing that I would like to remark on this is that having a background in studying Salafism and still studying Salafism, I am used to being very specific about what verse in the Quran do you base that on, what hadith, etc., and where do you get this argument, and that everything has to be accounted for, everything has to be justified on textual grounds. And that took a bit of getting used to, both for me and for the members of the Muslim Brotherhood, because they have a very broad view of Islam. And I remember talking to some people who said, you're asking such detailed questions. We don't really think about those things. And that was quite amusing in a way, that that I was asking detailed questions that they really didn't have the answer to, because they really didn't care about those theological issues. So that was quite interesting too.
Thank you, Dr. Wagemaker. There are a couple of questions in the chat box which was sent to me privately, because the audience, I mean, they are unable to switch on to the audio. So I'll just read out the question. The first one is, what was the effect of the jihad in Afghanistan on the Brotherhood in Jordan? And was Zarqawi an exception? And the second question is, can you please elaborate a bit on the relationship between Muslim Brotherhood in Jordan and the Hamas in Gaza?
Yeah. Well, with regards to Afghanistan, like many other people, the Muslim Brotherhood viewed the jihad in Afghanistan, the 1970s and 1980s, as a justified fight. They saw it as a foreign invasion. The Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan, a Muslim country, and they saw it as a justified jihad. I talked to people who told me that it was quite common for Jordanian mosques, for example, to have collection boxes outside mosques where you could donate money for the jihad in Afghanistan. So that was not at all out of the ordinary. And the Muslim Brotherhood was no exception. The primary example here, of course, is Abdullah Azzam, who was of Palestinian descent, but who grew up in Jordan, or partly grew up in Jordan, and who was the major force behind the Afghan Arabs in Afghanistan, who led the Arabs in Afghanistan and fought against the Soviet Union there. So the Muslim Brotherhood was very pro-jihad in Afghanistan, which perhaps gives the impression that they are in favor of global jihad of the type that Al-Qaeda presents, but that is very different, because the jihad in Afghanistan did not take on that form until after Abdullah Azzam had died, until after the Soviets had been kicked out, as it were, of Afghanistan. So by the time Zarqawi, who was also mentioned in the question, went to Afghanistan, which was in 1989, unless I'm very much mistaken, the fight against the Soviet Union was already over. And Zarqawi later on developed into a very sectarian-minded global jihadi of the sort of Al-Qaeda type. And the Muslim Brotherhood very much objected to that. There was one incident with regard to Zarqawi that was very, how shall I put this, very well, touchy in Jordan. Zarqawi, as many of you will know, was responsible for the 2005 hotel bombings in Amman, where dozens of people were killed, and as such was, cursed by everyone in Jordan. And you could really see the support for Al-Qaeda plummeting after that attack. But when he was killed in 2006, a year after, there was a wake in Azarqa, the city where he was from, and several representatives of the Muslim Brotherhood went to that wake and to give their condolences to the family of Zarqawi. Now, I presume that they were simply doing that as a sort of service to their constituents, because that's where they were from. And moreover, other members of parliament who were not from the Muslim Brotherhood also went there to do exactly the same thing. But the members of the Muslim Brotherhood were the ones who were punished, not only by a fine, but who were also put in prison for some time because they did that. And the regime allowed that to happen, to play into this narrative of, well, the Muslim Brotherhood may be slightly different from Zarqawi, but they support him nevertheless. But the fact of the matter was, of course, that the Muslim Brotherhood did not support Zarqawi. They supported the fight against the Americans in Iraq, but again, they did not encourage Jordanians to go there. They certainly did not support Zarqawi's sectarianism or his terrorism. And the only reason they went to give their condolences to Zarqawi's family in Zarqa was probably, as I said, as a service to their constituents. And they were the only ones being punished for it, not the other ones as well, the other parties. So just like in the previous questions with regard to Syria, the answer is not black and white. It has different shades of gray. I'm sorry, I forget the second question. Could you repeat that, please?
Just a minute. That was on the relationship between Muslim Brotherhood in Jordan and Hamas.
Oh, right. Yes. Yeah, the relationship between those two is very strong and has been very strong for a long time. because the West Bank of the River Jordan, which is now under the control of Israel/Palestinian Authority, used to be under the control of the Jordanian monarchy, of course. So the relationship between the Palestinian Muslim Brotherhood, which later grew into Hamas, on the one hand, and the Jordanian Muslim Brotherhood has always been very strong. So much so, in fact, that Hamas used to have its official presence in Jordan. And it was not until the 2000s that they were kicked out by King Hussein. But they have always maintained ties, ideological ties, very much also personal ties, because obviously there are many people of Palestinian descent in Jordan itself, and organizational ties. The Palestinian and the Jordanian Muslim Brotherhood have long been intertwined, as it were. But Hamas, as we know it nowadays, is really a separate organization, is mostly situated and organized in the Gaza Strip, which was never part of Jordan. And while there is strong solidarity, strong ideological affinity, strong organizational affinity between the two organizations, they are really two separate organizations.
Thank you, Dr. Joas Wagemakers. I think that was a very fascinating, kind of discussion. Before we wind up, I thought maybe I can add a couple of questions of my own, if you have, space some more time. First thing was, I was quite intrigued by the point you were making about the coexisting in relation to inclusion and moderation in relation to repression. The second point which you talked about, with Shadi Hamid talks about it, and I've read his book and I reviewed that book also. One of the things which I couldn't understand from what he was talking about was he only focusing more from the Egyptian experiences, or he's talking more about a broader idea of Islamism in the entire Middle East, and if we look at that, do you agree with his kind of cases that repression leads to, or also has led to, a kind of moderation, or is that only within the specific context of Egypt? The second thing is, again, you have very well pointed out the fact that one also has to not only look at the transnational movement, Muslim Brotherhood is, but a kind of national movement in terms of, for example, Jordan. The way Muslim Brotherhood behaves in other countries is widely different, in terms of its expression, in terms of ideological moderation, in terms of their understanding of freedom or issues related to women. But how do you see this idea of transnational, from your own understanding, since you have studied the subject in such depth, how do you look at this transnational movement, and maybe if one can go even beyond Middle East, just to kind of get your thought on that?
Right. Well, those are very interesting questions. Let me take the first one first, in the right order. I think that Shadi Hamid was talking about specifically about Jordan, Egypt, and Morocco. So he was talking about the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, the Islamic Action Front in Jordan, and the Party of Justice and Development in Morocco. He did take a broader look, but those are the three countries that he really focused on. And I think that his conclusions were general with regard to all three countries, but also specific with regard to Jordan. So he's indicated that the past 2 decades really, there was increased repression, and he's right in drawing that conclusion, and that the Muslim Brotherhood nevertheless continued to moderate ideologically. And again, he's correct in that conclusion. So I think it's both. He is specific about Jordan, and he's also talking in general. And with regard to the transnational dimensions, I think they learn from one another. They learn from each other's experiences. For example, if you look at Hassanat Warabi in Sudan, if you study the situation in Sudan, Hassan al-Turabi does not always come out very well, because he is very often seen and very often portrayed as an opportunist who wanted to do whatever was politically expedient for himself. He was not seen as very consistent. He was seen as, allying with anyone who could help his political career. And I'm not saying that this description is necessarily justified, but this is the impression that one often gets of Hassan al-Turabi. But this is very much a Sudanese description, perhaps, of the people, seeing the consequences of what he did in Sudan. But if you only read his books, and this is what other Muslim Brotherhoods did, including the one in Jordan, you could see that he was very progressive with regard to women's rights. And this is some of what they have adopted. So they learn from other experiences. The same thing applies, for example, to Hamas. Hamas, as I said in answer to the previous question, or not your question, but the one before that, was very often intertwined with the Jordanian Muslim Brotherhood. Now, if you look at the early history of the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, there were great discussions about democracy, including in the Jordanian Muslim Brotherhood. There was a whole debate in the early 1990s. Is it allowed to participate in a government of a regime that is not Islamic? So, for example, in Jordan. Once Hamas had to decide that question for itself, which was in the mid-1990s, so a few years later, they had to decide, can we participate in the elections of the Palestinian Authority, which is also not an Islamic regime, but, whatever you want to call it, but it's not Islamic. Their arguments were very, very pragmatic. I mean, people like Shaul Mishal and Avraham Sela, two Israeli scholars, have published on this. They have shown that the arguments and the considerations that Hamas took into account were all political in nature. Nowhere in the entire document that they say, this is not an Islamic regime, perhaps we shouldn't participate in it. So that was very interesting. And it's almost as if once that question about democracy or any other issue has been decided by one of the Muslim Brotherhoods in the region in one way or the other, that almost gives permission for the other Muslim Brotherhoods to go in the same direction without much discussion. So they really learn from one another, and they really use each other's arguments to continue in that same direction and not have to reinvent the wheel, as it were. They are not striving to do the same thing twice. I mean, once that decision has been made by one, they can learn from one another. Perhaps somewhat comparable to how federalists, staunch federalists in the United States sometimes talk about state solutions in the United States. So if one state tries something and it works, then other states try it as well. You could argue perhaps that works the same way in India as well. I don't know, but that's perhaps a good comparison to how the Muslim Brotherhood works internationally too.
Okay, thank you. There are a couple of more questions which have come at the last minute, and these are mostly related to the Egyptian Muslim Brotherhood and their experiences and any relation with Jordan. If you would like to kind of add, I think most of the point which you have already discussed.
Right. Yeah, I think the first one about the Egyptian democratic transition, that was an important lesson for the Jordanian Muslim Brotherhood, because they saw, look, the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt at first did not want to engage in the elections in all districts, did not want to run for the presidency, but eventually they did. And that was seen as a threat to the regime. And one thing that is really common to all Islamists in the region is that they usually do not participate to win. So, I mean, Nathan Brown has written this very interesting and important book called When Victory is Not an Option. I mean, victory is not an option for these groups because they know we should not strive for victory, because if we do that, then we will be crushed by the regime. They will not allow that. We should only participate for, say, 1/3 or half or 2/3 of the seats. And that is something that message was really driven home for the Jordanian Muslim Brotherhood by the experiences of the situation in Egypt. And the second one, apologize if this was already answered, how strong is Jordanian Muslim Brotherhood? Yeah, how strong they are. I think the Muslim Brotherhood in Jordan is much weaker, not only because they've been outlawed, I mean, historically speaking, that is, The Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt is obviously the mother organization. The spiritual guide, or the general guide of the organization, is always an Egyptian. You could argue that both organizations are now outlawed, so they're both equally weak. But the Muslim Brotherhood in Jordan has never supplied as many thinkers, as many ideologues, as many books, as many publications as the one in Egypt has done. And I think, there is a saying in the Arab world: Egyptians write books, Lebanese publish them, and Iraqis read them. I don't know about the Iraqis reading them, because I know not enough about Iraq, but I mean, the Lebanese certainly publish them, and the Egyptians certainly write them. And there are quite some Jordanians who write books about this, but the number of books, the sheer number of books is far smaller in Jordan than it is in Egypt.
Thank you, Dr. Joas Wagemaker. I think, first of all, thank you for your time and for taking the effort to explain the finer nuances of understanding the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt. And you have kind of, as I said in the beginning, after your presentation, that you have really unpacked something which was very kind of packed and not really easy to understand. So, and everyone would agree that they have taken something from this presentation, and we really look forward to read your book. To say the final word, I'll now request Sir to.
Thank you.